length said, in her sweet and cordial benevolence, "I'm glad to see we think alike about cleanliness." And Rachel had replied with an air at once deferential, sweet, and yet casual, "Oh, of course, Mrs. Maldon." Then they measured one another in a silent exchange. Mrs. Maldon was aware that she had by chance discovered a pearl, yes, a treasure beyond pearls. And Rachel, too, divined the high value of her employer, and felt within the stirrings of a passionate loyalty towards her. III. And yet, during the 3 weeks and a half of their joint existence, Rachel's estimate of Mrs. Maldon had undergone certain subtle modifications. At first somewhat overawed, Rachel had seen in her employer the Mrs. Maldon of the town's legend, which legend had travelled to Rachel as far as Knype, whence she sprang. That is to say, one of the great ladies of Bursley, ranking in the popular regard with Mrs. Clayton Vernon, the leader of society, Mrs. Sutton, the philanthropist, and Mrs. Hamps, the powerful religious bully. She had been impressed by her height, Rachel herself being no lamp-post, her carriage, her superlative dignity, her benevolence of thought, and above all by her aristocratic southern accent. After 48 years of the Five Towns, Mrs. Maldon had still kept most of that southern accent, so intimidating to the rough, broad talkers of the district, who take revenge by mocking it among themselves, but for whom it will always possess the thrilling prestige of high life. And then, day by day, Rachel had discovered that great ladies are, after all, human creatures, strangely resembling other human creatures. And Mrs. Maldon slowly became for her an old woman of 72, with unquestionably wondrous hair, but failing in strength and in faculties, and it grew merely pathetic to Rachel that Mrs. Maldon should force herself always to sit straight upright. As for Mrs. Maldon's charitableness, Rachel could not deny that she refused to think evil, and yet it was plain that at bottom Mrs. Maldon was not much deceived about people, in which apparent inconsistency there hid a slight disturbing suggestion of falseness that mysteriously fretted the downright Rachel. Again, beneath Mrs. Maldon's modesty concerning the merits of her sitting-room, Rachel soon fancied that she could detect traces of an ingenuous and possibly senile house-pride, which did more than fret the lady companion, it faintly offended her. That one should be proud of a possession or of an achievement was admissible, but that one should fail to conceal the pride absolutely was to Rachel, with her Five Towns character, a sign of weakness, a sign of the soft South. Lastly, Mrs. Maldon had, it transpired, her ways. For example, in the matter of blinds and in the matter of tapers. She would actually insist on the gas being lighted with a taper. A paper spill, which was just as good and better, seemed to ruffle her benign placidity, and she was funnily economical with matches. Rachel had never seen a taper before, and could not conceive where the old lady managed to buy the things. In short, with admiration almost undiminished, and with a rapidly growing love and loyalty, Rachel had arrived at the point of feeling glad that she, a mature, capable, sagacious, and strong woman, was there to watch over the last years of the waning and somewhat peculiar old lady. Mrs. Maldon did not see the situation from quite the same angle. She did not, for example, consider herself to be in the least peculiar, but on the contrary, a very normal woman. She had always used tapers. She could remember the period when everyone used tapers. In her view, tapers were far more genteel and less dangerous than the untidy, flaring spill, which she abhorred as a vulgarity. As for matches, frankly, it would not have occurred to her to waste a match when fire was available. In the matter of her sharp insistence on drawn blinds at night, domestic privacy seemed to be one of the fundamental decencies of life, simply that. And as for house-pride, she considered that she locked away her fervent feeling for her parlour in a manner marvellous and complete. No one could or ever would guess the depth of her attachment to that sitting-room, nor the extent to which it engrossed her emotional life. And yet she had only occupied the house for 14 years out of the 45 years of her widowhood, and the furniture had at intervals been renewed, for Mrs. Maldon would on no account permit herself to be old-fashioned. Indeed, she had had 5 different sitting-rooms in 5 different houses since her husband's death. No matter. They were all the same sitting-room, all rendered identical by the mysterious force of her dreamy meditations on the past. And moreover, sundry important articles had remained constant to preserve unbroken the chain that linked her to her youth. The table which Rachel had so nicely laid was the table at which Mrs. Maldon had taken her first meal as mistress of a house. Her husband had carved mutton at it, and grumbled about the consistency of toast. Her children had spilt jam on its cloth. And when, on Sunday nights, she wound up the bracket clock on the mantelpiece, she could see and hear a handsome young man in a long frock coat and a large shirt front and a very thin black tie winding it up too, her husband, on Sunday nights. And she could simultaneously see another handsome young man winding it up, her son. Her pictures were admired. "Your son painted this watercolour, did he not, Mrs. Maldon?" "Yes, my son Athelstan." "How gifted he must have been!" "Yes, the best judges say he showed very remarkable promise. It's fading, I fear. I ought to cover it up, but somehow I can't fancy covering it up." The hand that had so remarkably promised had lain mouldering for a quarter of a century. Mrs. Maldon sometimes saw it, fleshless, on a cage-like skeleton in the dark grave. The next moment she would see herself tending its chilblains. And if she was not peculiar, neither was she waning. No! 72, but not truly old. How could she be truly old when she could see, hear, walk a mile without stopping, eat anything whatever, and dress herself unaided? And that hair of hers! Often she was still a young wife or a young widow. She was not preparing for death. She had prepared for death in the 70s. She expected to live on in calm satisfaction through indefinite decades. She savoured life pleasantly, for its daily security was impregnable. She had forgotten grief. When she looked up at Rachel and benevolently nodded to her, she saw a girl of line character, absolutely trustworthy, very devoted, very industrious, very capable, intelligent, cheerful, in fact a splendid girl, a girl to be enthusiastic about. But such a mere girl, a girl with so much to learn, so pathetically young and inexperienced and positive and sure of herself. The looseness of her limbs, the unconscious abrupt freedom of her gestures, the waviness of her auburn hair, the candour of her glance, the warmth of her indignation against injustice and dishonesty, the capricious and sensitive flowings of blood to her smooth cheeks, the ridiculous wise compressings of her lips, the rise and fall of her rich and innocent bosom, these phenomena touched Mrs. Maldon and occasionally made her want to cry. Thought she, "I was never so young as that at 22. At 22 I had had Mary." The possibility that in spite of having had Mary, who would now have been 50 but for death, she had as a fact been approximately as young as that at 22, did not ever present itself to the waning and peculiar old lady. She was glad that she, a mature and profoundly experienced woman, in full possession of all her faculties, was there to watch over the development of the lovable, affectionate, and impulsive child. Part 4. "Oh, here's the paper, Mrs. Maldon," said Rachel, as, turning away to leave the room, she caught sight of the extra special edition of the Signal, which lay a pale green on the dark green of the Chesterfield. Mrs. Maldon answered placidly, "When did you bring it in? I never heard the boy come. But my hearing's not quite what it used to be, that's true. Open it for me, my dear. I can't stretch my arms as I used to." She was one of the few women in the Five Towns who deigned to read a newspaper regularly, and one of the still fewer who would lead the miscellaneous conversation of drawing-rooms away from domestic chatter and discussions of individualities to political and municipal topics, and even towards general ideas. She seldom did more than mention a topic, and then express a hope for the best, or explain that this phenomenon was such a pity, or that phenomenon such a good thing, or that about another phenomenon one really didn't know what to think. But these remarks sufficed to class her apart among her sex as a very up-to-date old lady with a broad outlook upon the world, and to inspire sundry other ladies with a fearful respect for her masculine intellect and judgment. She was aware of her superiority, and had a certain kind disdain for the increasing number of women who took in a daily picture paper, and who, having dawdled over its illustrations after breakfast, spoke of what they had seen in the newspaper. She would not allow that a picture paper was a newspaper. Rachel stood in the empty space under the gas. Her arms were stretched out and slightly upward as she held the Signal wide open and glanced at the newspaper, frowning. The light fell full on her coppery hair. Her balanced body, though masked in front by the perpendicular fall of the apron as she bent somewhat forward, was nevertheless the image of potential vivacity and energy. It seemed almost to vibrate with its own consciousness of physical pride. Left alone, Rachel would never have opened a newspaper, at any rate for the news. Until she knew Mrs. Maldon, she had never seen a woman read a newspaper for aught except the advertisements relating to situations, houses, and pleasures. But, much more than she imagined, she was greatly under the influence of Mrs. Maldon. Mrs. Maldon made a nightly solemnity of the newspaper, and Rachel naturally soon persuaded herself that it was a fine and a superior thing to read the newspaper, a proof of unusual intelligence. Moreover, just as she felt bound to show Mrs. Maldon that her notion of cleanliness was as advanced as anybody's, so she felt bound to indicate, by an appearance of casualness, that for her to read the paper was the most customary thing in the world. Of course she read the paper, and that she should calmly look at it herself before handing it to her mistress proved that she had already established a very secure position in the